Okay, let's talk about the last chapter of book one of the rent of land. This is a very long chapter. It doesn't just talk about the rent of land, but it goes into detail discussing the different types of produce of land, from food to materials of house and clothing, to mines that produce coal and metals, especially gold and silver. And yeah, it talks about a lot of stuff. It's a very long chapter, about 150 pages, and I'm condensing it into 12 slides, trying to present the key ideas, right? The main logical flow, without losing too much detail. Okay, so here are the key points mentioned in the beginning of the chapter. Rent is the highest which the tenant can afford to pay after paying the wages of labor and taking the profits of stock. I think this is specifically referring to the case of a person as a farmer rent a piece of land and employ people to cultivate that land, right? But I think this statement kind of applies to house and apartment rent as well. Just make a little bit of connection to personal experience. So I was living in Canada, right, during my undergrad and graduate studies. And at that time, the rent in Waterloo, Ontario, and also in places north of Toronto, they're usually in the range of 500 to 800 Canadian dollars per month, which is the rent that I'm used to. But then when I moved to New York City, right, suddenly rent about 3,000 a month becomes quite commonplace. Why is that? I imagine the demand for housing isn't necessarily that much greater than in the places where I live in Canada. I mean, the ratio of the people who need housing versus the number of rooms, the number of landlords that can provide housing, the ratio isn't that, I don't think it's that much bigger in New York City compared to in the places where I lived in Canada. It's certainly not like more than 3-4 times. But why is the rent in New York so high? Right. I imagine it's because New Yorkers, there are a lot of people who earn quite a bit and they can afford to pay high rent. Right. It's not because the house itself, the apartment itself, due to demand and supply, worth that much price. It's also because the tenants being richer than the tenants in Canada, they can generally afford to pay more. Yeah, and I also think just my personal thoughts, right? The housing market is a lot more monopolistic than many other markets. First, due to high barrier to entry, right? You think about buying a house in Manhattan, how much would that cost, right? And also, if you live in a city, right? If you work in a city, then chances are you're gonna have to live in the city or places near that city, right? You cannot find a job in New York City and somehow live in Austin, Texas, unless you are allowed to work fully remote, right? So the market for rent, right? This case for apartment, and in Adam Smith's case, what he's discussing for farming, it's restricted to your vicinity, right? In the place of where you work, where your occupation is, right? So it's a limited market, and the landlord in the market, they can kind of command a monopolistic price. Unlike many other commodities, right? Like Apple, you can buy the Apple from Asia, from America, from God knows where, right? So I think that's why as Adam Smith said, right? High rent is the effect of high earning, high prices, right? Whereas high or low wages and profits are causes of high or low prices. And then this chapter is mainly divided into 3 parts. First part discusses the produce of land that always afford rent. And second part discusses the produce of land that sometimes does not afford rent. The first part, yeah, the produce of land that always afford rent is just food, right? And everything else produced by land, the land that produces everything else goes into the second category, the land which sometimes does not afford rent. And yeah, and the third part of this chapter discusses the variations in the value between these two produce, these two type of produce, food versus everything else. Okay, now let's go into the details. Part 1, the produce of land which always afford rent. That is food, right? Because food is always in demand. Everyone needs to eat, and land always produces more food than what is necessary to bring it into a market. Why is that? Well, let's just think logically, right? Let's prove by contradiction. Let's suppose land is not enough or just enough. Let's say land is just enough to produce. Land is just able to produce just enough food. As what is necessary to bring it to market, the wages of the laborer and the profit of the farmer, right? Then what would happen? Then everybody in the entire society would be employed in cultivating land, which is not the case, right? You see only a portion of people are cultivating land, while there are many other people who do not produce any food at all, right? They work in other occupations. So yeah, so that statement is definitely correct, right? Land produces more food than what is necessary to bring the food to market. And that means land which produce food will always have a surplus, right, than what is necessary to pay the wage and profits. And this surplus naturally goes to rent. And the rent of land produces food. The rent of land that produces food depends on both the fertility and the location of that land. That it depends on fertility is pretty self-evident, but why location as well? Because think about it, right? A farmland that's close to a big city, the cost of transporting its food to its market, right? There's a big city, big market right close by. So the cost of transportation is lower. So that means after deducting the wages of farm labor, the profits of the farmer, and the cost of transportation, there's a larger chunk left for rent, right? Whereas in remote places, the cost of transporting the food to its markets is a lot higher. That leaves less for rent, and that's why. So food, there are 2 types of food, right? The mainly grain versus meat, right? So as Adam Smith called it, the land that produce grain, or as he called it, corn, cornland versus pasture, right? Pasture produces animal food. So how are the value of these 2 produce related? Well, initially, vast unimproved land, right? Wild land abandoned to wild cattle, right? And then in that rude state, cattle worth little more than the labor to catch it. And also, so that's one thing. Cattle used to be much cheaper in very ancient time when society was not that well developed. And also, cornland produces more food per unit area than pasture. Why is that, right? Because it's very easy to understand logically because animal, they offer a lot less for food than the amount of food they consume, right? And when meat was cheap back then in the ancient time, and also cornland produces more food per unit area than pasture. As a result, cornland, of course, can afford much higher rent than pasture. But as cultivation extends, right? But as cultivation extends and population grows, the amount of wild land, unimproved land, reduces, right? And the wild cattle, the amount of wild animal reduce too. So cultivation extends, population grows, less wild animals, less meat. The demand for meat is less satisfied, and meat price goes up, driving up the and as meat price goes up, the rent for pasture land goes up too, right? Adam Smith gives an example of the Scottish Highland estates, right? So the union of Scotland and England, which happened in 1707, opened up the English market to Scottish cattle, right? Hence, in the course of the 18th century, the price of Scottish cattle tripled. And as a result, the rent of the Scottish Highland estates, many of them tripled, even quadrupled during the 18th century. So that's a perfect example for Adam Smith's point. And he made another statement: the rent and profit of cornland regulates that of pasture. What does he mean by that? That means if it's more profitable to cultivate land to raise cattle than to raise corn, then the cornland would be converted to pasture, and then later reach a new state of equilibrium, and then the profit of the pasture would be the same as the profit of the cornland as well. So that's what he means. And then following the same logic, right, the profit of cornland and pasture both regulate those of all other lands, right? Because if other lands are more profitable, then cornland and pasture would be converted to this other land and reaching a new state of equilibrium. So thus concludes the first part, talking about rent originated from producing food, from plant food and animal food. Now moving on to part two of the produce of land, which may or may not afford rent. So after food, right? Clothing and lodging are the two great demands of humankind. Land in its original state, right? Wild land can afford lots of materials, and can afford more material of clothing and lodging than it can feed, right? Because you see there are lots of stones laying around, lots of timber, lots of trees, right? And you can cut these trees, carve these stones, and make houses and huts. And there are not that many people, right? So these are more than enough to clothe and lodge. Oh yeah, clothes is lots of wild animal, right? So the wild animals and stones and timber, they are more than enough. They were more than enough to clothe and lodge the number of people in these root ancient states, in the root ancient state of society. But later, as cultivation extends, right, wild land become less, people become more. The land can end up being able to feed more people than it can easily clothe and lodge, right? Because the material of clothing and lodging, wild animal and timber, becoming much less in proportion to people. And then as a result, the price for this material goes up, and this material later afford rent too. And the materials of clothing can more easily afford rent than those of lodging. Why is that? Because the skin of animals, right? Let's say wool and hides, they are light, right? And then their value in proportion to their weight is relatively high. So it's a lot easier to transport them and open up a large market for them, right? Whereas timber and stone, right, they are quite bulky, right? And their value in proportion to their weight is relatively small. So their market, as a result, was much smaller and cannot that easily afford rent. And he also mentioned that the demand for materials of clothing and lodging increases with the greater ease of obtaining food, right? Because you see, the desire for food is bounded by the stomach, right? You cannot eat more than your stomach can hold. But the desire for clothing and lodging is unbounded, right? You can live a huge ass house. You can change clothes 3 times a day, no problem, right? And yeah, that's why later, right, the price for this material goes up, and then they for rent. And this one is just an interesting statement. Rent proportion is generally 1/3 of above ground produce. Why emphasize above ground? Because later he's going to talk about below ground produce, those extracted from mine, coal, metals, right? Both coarse metal and precious metal like gold and silver. Okay, now let's move on to the produce coming from mines, right? He mentioned that the location of a metallic mine is much less important than that of a coal mine. That again is because of the value to weight ratio, right? Because coal is much less valuable, right? It doesn't make too much sense to transport them for a long distance. The cost of transportation would be a much greater proportion to their value than that of metals, right? So the location of coal mine is very important. Whereas metals, right, their value to weight ratio is quite high, right? Even if you transport metals to very long distance, right, the cost of transportation only makes a small part of the value of the metal. So the location of a metallic mine isn't really that important. And also because the metal, right, they come to compete with other metals coming all around the world, then that makes the metallic mines less profitable than most of the above ground estates, right? And as a result, rent makes only a small share in the price of metals. Okay. Yeah, let's move on to the next point. the source of value for precious metals, right, are their utility, beauty, and scarcity. Utility as utensils, right? You can use silver and gold for utensils, right? And also ornaments. That's the reason for beauty here. And scarcity, that's an interesting point. He points out for rich people, right? The gold and silver, they can act as a mark of opulence, since common people can't have any of these. Only these rich people can. So the scarcity of these metals itself constitutes a very important component of the value of gold and silver. And all these three attributes, right, they were antecedents to these metals being used as coins. And the next point, rent of metals of the rent of mines of precious metal is proportional to their relative fertility. Why is that, right? Because one, the precious metals, they compete with each other globally, right? So even if one mine is fertile, it doesn't matter, right? If another mine is 10 times more fertile, then that would render the first mine pretty much useless. And also, abundant supply could add little to the wealth of the world, right? The abundant supplies of precious metal, they can only add very little to the wealth of the world, right? Because with scarcity being a major source of their value, fertile mines can only reduce the value of these metals. But the rent of estates above ground, right, is proportional to their absolute fertility. And here are just some data showing you the proportion of rent for different types of metals, right? So tin mines in Cornwall, 1/6. Silver mines of Peru. By the way, when he says Peru, it means the viceroyalty of Peru, which included modern-day Peru and Bolivia, and I think part of Argentina as well. So that's not modern-day Peru. Just one note. So before 1736, silver mines of Peru were paying 20% tax to the King of Spain. And you can see that as a some sort of rent, right? But then after 1736, the value of silver being much, much reduced due to the abundance of the mines in Peru, they could only afford 1/10 for the tax to the Spanish king, right? And then the gold mines of Peru even can afford even less rent, right? Only paying 5% tax to the king of Spain. Now move on to the next chapter. not the next chapter, the next part 3 of the chapter, the long chapter. The variations in the relative values of the two sorts of produce. What it means is how the value of food versus everything else change as society progress, right? So what I mean by everything else produced by land. So the increasing abundance of food must necessarily increase the demand for every part of the produce of land, which is not food, right? Because as people can get more food more easily, they start to demand other things, right? And also as population grows, the demand for everything else must grow as well. And so the increased abundance of food will increase the demand for everything else and raising the land that produces everything else other than food. But there's one exception though. That exception being silver. The value of silver fell after discovery of the American mines in the 1500s, mainly in the Spanish Americas. And then so this chapter, this part, right, itself can be divided into three parts. Part one talks about the value of silver, how it changes over the course of about 400 years before writing of this book. And then second portion of this part three of the chapter talks about the effects of progress of improvements on three sorts of root produce. One clarification though, these three sorts of root produce are all animal products. So it basically talks about the progress of improvement on three different sorts of animal products. And lastly, it talks about the effects of progress of improvement on the real price of manufacturers. Okay, so interesting little digression on the value of silver through time. So the value of silver through time from about 1350 to Adam Smith's time can be divided into three periods. In the first period, from about 1359 to 1570, the value of silver rose in Europe. So the evidence Adam Smith provided was the wheat price per quarter, right, went from about 4-ounce silver to about 2-ounce silver in England. And the same fall in grain price, in corn price, is observed in France too, in the same period, right? And then if the value of grain fell, right, that means the value of silver is rising, right? And to make things clear, right, Adam Smith mentioned that the data point that he took were price that's not recorded due to their extraordinary due to the price being extraordinarily high or extraordinarily low, right? The prices that he's using were stated in some statutes or just from some records of some banquet or something, right? So this has to be the ordinary price at those times. And in the second period, right, from 1570 to 1636, the value of silver fell in Europe. And that's mainly due to the discovery of the mines of Potosi, discovered in 1545 in modern-day Bolivia, and at that time in the Viceroyalty of Peru. And wheat price rose from 2-ounce per quarter to about 6 to 8 ounce, right? So you see the inflation taking effect, right? And the value of silver fall. So that's the second period. These are just two paintings showing the mines of Potosi, right? So first you show the mountain in Potosi, right? The mountain that contains a whole lot of silver. In fact, I heard that they dug so much silver out of this mountain that the summit of this mountain sunk, I think more than 10 meters over the years. And the second picture shows you a cross-sectional view, right? The working conditions is pretty bad in the mines, and it's estimated that several million people has lost their lives working the mine in Potosi. Quite bloody stuff. And third period, right? Third period is after 1633. So in the third period, right, the value of silver rose again because the because as society evolved, right, more commodities being circulated, and if the increase of silver supply is not catching up with the increase of the amount of commodities being circulated, as a result, the value of silver will rise in relation to these commodities. So the average wheat price in 1637 to 1700 was 2.06% higher than that of 1621 to 1636, as recorded by Eton College on the price of wheat in the Windsor market. And then in the same market, right, the price of the price of wheat fell more than 20%, right, in the first 64 years of the 18th century compared to the last 64 years in the in the 16th century, right? So that means in the third period, silver is perhaps rising. Well, I guess it first kind of stagnate and even fell a little bit more, but nothing compared to if the amount by which it fell before. And then later, the price of silver rose, right? Because the price of corn fell. And some little historical fact, right? Why did the price of silver was still falling, right, after 1636, right, in the 64 years after 1636? That's because of three things. First, the English Civil War, right? That drove wheat price very high in several years. And then there was a bounty on the exportation of corn being announced in 1688, right? So that if you export a certain amount of grain, right, you would get a certain amount of reward. Why did the English government do that? The purpose was to encourage cultivation, right? The more you cultivate, the more you export, you get more reward. So that's a long-term effect, right? The short-term effect would, of course, be increasing the scarcity, leading to scarcity of wheat in the domestic market and rising wheat price. And the third reason was the clipping of coins during the time of Charles II. So the silver content in the coin will go down, right? And then the denomination has to go up, right, to compensate for the reduction in a given amount of denomination. That's just one interesting little aside about the origin of the dollar sign. So I mentioned the mines of Potosi, right? It was super abundant. In fact, I heard from a video in the second half of 16th century, right, which is 1550 to 1600, about 60% of the world's silver production came from the mines of Potosi. And Potosi, the coins produced at Potosi, they had this little symbol. It's just overlaying the letters PTSI all together, representing Potosi. And one theory on the origin of the dollar sign is that this symbol, right, later was simplified, taking out the T and P, leaving only S and I, and then voila, that's the $sign. Okay, moving on to the next part. the effects of the progress of improvement on three sorts of animal produce. First, the type that cannot be multiplied by human industry, wild animals, games, right? Their real value, right, aka the amount of food and subsistence they can exchange, can rise without boundary. One example he gave was a nightingale, right? Just a little bird, costs 50 pounds of money in well, that's after doing some conversion, right? Costs about 50 pounds of money in Adam Smith's time. That nightingale was presented to Empress Agrippina, the mother of Nero, at the height of the Roman Empire. Quite crazy, right? Because in Adam Smith's time, if a laborer earns about 40 pounds a year, that's considered as a pretty decent income. And the bird costs more than the laborer, the wage of a man's labor for a year. Ridiculous. And the other sort of animal produce, livestock, right? They can be multiplied at will. And because they can be multiplied at will, their real value can rise, but with a certain boundary, right? And that boundary, as mentioned before, is when raising these animals were as profitable as raising grain, right? Raising corn, because once they become raising these livestock become more profitable than raising corn, cornland will be converted to pasture, and these and the profit will be more or less equalized, right? Okay. And there's a third part, right? The third part of the animal produce are things like wool, hides, fish, and so on. Where the efficacy of human industry is limited or uncertain. I need to correct one mistake, right? It's not all animal produce. He actually put metals in the third category as well. Anyways, so I was trying to understand the logic. Why does he say wool and hides, right? Which came from sheep and cattle, which human industry can multiply at will. Why does he say in producing these things, human industry, the efficacy of human industry is limited or uncertain? Here's my understanding. Perhaps it's because people don't raise cattle just for the sake of the hides, right? Meat is the main motivation. Hence, the amount of hides is limited by the amount of cattle being multiplied for the need of meat, right? So hence, given a certain amount of cattle raised for the sake of meat and cultivation, perhaps, the amount of hide you can get from these cattle is limited. I guess the same logic perhaps goes to sheep, but that is questionable, right? Maybe it's more valuable. The sheep's wool is more valuable than the sheep's meat. I don't know. But anyways, he categorized it in the same type. One interesting observation, wool and hides were originally already valuable, even in the root state of society, where most land were not improved. Why is that? Because, as I mentioned before, their value are pretty high compared to their weight, and they can be transferred to faraway places. And that means their market is large. They can afford quite a bit of profit. But the policies of the United Kingdom has lowered the price of wool in England, right? So here are the policy regarding wool. Absolute prohibition of exporting wool from England And 2, permission of importing it from Spain, duty-free. And 3, prohibition of exporting it from Ireland to anywhere but England. I suppose the goal is to encourage textile industry in England. And that's why the policies were directed in such a way. Certainly, that's very good for textile manufacturing, producing clothes, but I suppose hurtful for those people who raise sheep. Yeah, there's another interesting little fact about hides. There are certain countries who produce hides, but do not have any manufacturing facilities that process them. So in order to store them, right, before they can be further processed, they would need to be salted. But if once salted, they would be less valuable than fresh hides. So that's why hides in a country that also process and manufacture these hides would be more valuable than in a country who is forced to salt the hides and send them abroad to be further processed. Yeah, and he also mentioned that fishing is the efficacy of human industries uncertain. Metals as well, you dig a mine, right? This mine may or may not be fertile, so the efficacy of your industry is uncertain. And for these produce, right, the real value may rise, may fall. It's hard to say with the progress of improvement. And one interesting little discussion on cattle, I think that's worth mentioning. He explains how does the increase of price of cattle help with cultivation, right? So high price of cattle is beneficial for cultivation. Why is that? Let's go with his logic, right? Let's understand the reasoning. Well, the quality of cultivated, the quantity of the quality of cultivated land is proportional to the amount of manure the farm produces. Why is that? Why can't you not just import manure from other places? I suppose was because back then, right, transportation being in the state as it were, it doesn't really make sense to transport manure far in a very far distance, right? Because these are just like cow dungs, right? The value to weight ratio is quite low, right? So it doesn't make sense to transport them far away. So you kind of have to use the manure produced on the farm itself, right? But you see, how do you get manure, right? You get manure from more cattle, right? More cattle you have, more cow dung you have. But farmers cannot afford to raise more cattle than what is necessary for tillage, unless the price of cattle is sufficient to pay the rent and profit of cultivated land. What does he mean by that? So unless, right, raising cattle can afford as much rent and profit as raising corn, then the farmer would have no motivation to raise more cattle than what is necessary for cultivating his land. And what can make the land, right, profitable for raising cattle, right? Then the price of cattle has to go to a certain height, right? So, and then he mentioned the example of Scotland again, right? Before and after Union. So in the Low Country of Scotland before the Union, well-manured land seldom exceed 1/3 or 1/4 of the whole farm. But after the Union, the state has been improved a lot. And for that reason, right, the improvement of land and the increase of stock, I guess here specific means livestock, go hand in hand. And lastly, the effects of progress of improvement on manufacturers. Well, with better machinery and more proper division of labor, the price of manufacturers would have to reduce, right? Because with much less labor, you can produce as much output or even more. And both the manufacturers made of coarse metals and in manufacturers made and in clothing, right? This trend can be observed. So one little anecdote: a watch that's worth about 20 pounds in the mid 1600s could be sold for about 20 shillings in Adam Smith's time, right? So that's a very notable reduction. And similar reduction can be observed in the clothing industry if you compare prices from the 1400s to prices in the 1600s and 1700s. Now here comes the conclusion of this chapter. Every improvement in in society raises rent, right? The improvement of land raises directly by increasing the amount of produce of land, and and also raising the value of cattle. And the improvement that lowers the price of manufacturers increases rent indirectly, right? Because the landlord can now get much more of the manufacturer with less of his own rent, right? So that's indirectly raising the rent the landlord gets. And the interests of landlords and laborers align with that of the society, right? So as mentioned in chapter 8, right, in a progressing society, stock competing for labor, laborers are well rewarded, and also, right, as the land produces more output, right, the landlord can get more from rent. But the interest of employers, the interest of those who live by profits, is not necessarily so, right? Because they have two main objectives. One is to widen the market. That can be good for the society too, but in the same time, they want to reduce competition and establish monopoly. And that can never be good for the public interest. And this concludes my summary of the last chapter of Book 1.